Hello, my name is Debbie Patel, and I'm co-chair of Grassroots North Shore. In Wisconsin, we have to be nimble, partly because of our politics. We have to be able to follow what's going on and make changes and do what needs to be done. We also have to be ever vigilant. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, being vigilant about two disastrous amendments to our Constitution that you will find probably on the backside at the very bottom of your ballot on August 13. Yes, August 13. The election with the lowest turnout every year. And I will add, it is the very first time that the legislature has put an amendment on the ballot in an August election. And it's important for you to know why you should vote no in August. But first, I want to say a few things about Grassroots North Shore, especially for those who don't know us as well as many of you do. We are a progressive organization. We support candidates who share our values and causes that reflect those values. Those values include things like our children's freedom to learn, our freedom to get medical care when we need without worrying about going bankrupt, our freedom to provide for our families, our freedom to control our own bodies and our families, and our freedom to vote. Every action Grassroots North Shore takes is an effort to protect our freedoms, our families, and our futures. And not just our futures, but everyone's future. Tonight, we're going to hear three unique perspectives on the legislature's latest power grab. And that's what it is, pure and simple. It's a power grab. Then my co-chair at Grassroots, Cheryl Moranto, will tell you what you can do to make a difference. When you work hard and do things, you have no time to worry. And there's plenty to worry about today. So we work harder, so we worry less. First up, we hear from Secretary of State Sarah Godlewski. In 2018, she saved the office of the Wisconsin Treasurer. She's now our Secretary of State. From the moment I met Sarah, and I remember it well, it was an outdoor activity in the summer of 2018. The moment I heard her talk, I knew she was the real deal. I am grateful to have her as a friend, and she has important messages to share with us about what's happening now. Take it away, Sarah.
Hello, Grassroots North Shore. It is really nice to be here with you virtually. I know it's much better when we can be in person, but I'm grateful to still be able to share with you about things that are going on with this constitutional amendment, because we know that these amendments, and we've seen how dangerous they can be, especially the one that we're going to have an opportunity to vote on this August, which is yet another power grab attempt by the legislature to basically remove checks and balances with regards to federal funds. And we all in Wisconsin have seen how important federal funds have and will continue to be to our state, whether it is with COVID, to emergencies. It is federal funds that are critical to our community. And these amendments are going to create yet another level of complexity by only giving the legislature the authority to do that. And when I look at these constitutional amendments that have happened over the last few years in Wisconsin, I've been calling them these kind of undercover threats to our democracy. And the reason is part of it is because of the process. So, unlike states like Kansas and Ohio that we've heard about recently with their constitutional amendments and how they were able to get abortion on the ballot, and then they voted to make that a right written into their constitution, Wisconsin does not have direct democracy with our constitutional amendments. So, how does a constitutional amendment get even on the ballot? It's through the legislature. So, our legislature in Wisconsin proposes what a constitutional amendment can be, and it has to pass by a majority, not just for one legislative session, but for two legislative sessions. And one of the biggest differences is that unlike when a bill becomes a law, it doesn't need to get approved by the governor. The governor can't veto or approve a constitutional amendment that's going to be on the ballot. And so what that means is the legislature then, as this kind of sole body, can then determine a few things. One is when are these constitutional amendments going to be on our ballot? One would hope that we would put these on the ballot at a time when we have the most Wisconsinites participating in our democracy, since we're trying to change our fundamental documents to how we govern our state. So they control the timing. The second thing that the legislature controls is they also control the wording behind these constitutional amendments. And we have seen recently how they are so confusing and manipulative in nature in how they want Wisconsinites to vote. We saw this most recently in the spring election, where they brought two constitutional amendments about trying to restrict resources with supporting our local clerks. And when you would read that at first, you were like, oh, yeah, we shouldn't have outside money supporting these clerks. But what we know is that those funds that clerks were applying for were helping with regards to getting access to the ballot. During COVID, they were providing PPE, like the protective equipment that folks were wearing, or the hazard pay. And so these funds were really critical. And now that is no longer an option because of the wording of the constitutional amendment that happened last spring. So they are able to purposefully kind of manipulate and control the wording on how we read these constitutional amendments. And then the third thing that they're able to control is it going to be a vote yes or this kind of vote no amendment? And the reason why I share this is that from 1996 to 2024, so basically over the past 3 decades, we have seen 12 constitutional amendments that have come to the people of Wisconsin. And we have only, of those 12, successfully defeated one. So it is very hard, just historically speaking, to actually defeat a constitutional amendment. And so these are two amendments that we're trying to get folks to vote no against, and that's really hard. And the only time that we have been able to successfully defeat a constitutional amendment was when they were trying to remove the state treasurer's office. And some of you might remember that's actually how I got involved in politics. I thought it was incredibly suspicious that the legislature was trying to get rid of the state treasurer. That was a check and balance in how we spend our funds. And so what I thought I would also share with all of you are a few lessons learned for how we successfully kind of organized to successfully defeat this constitutional amendment. So a few takeaways from the state treasurer, which I think is very similar to what we're seeing with these constitutional amendments. This, once again, eliminating checks and balances and a power grab. The first goes with visibility and connection. So a lot of folks that I've been talking to recently are like, oh, Sarah, I don't need to participate in the August primary ballot because I don't have anybody in my community that's running in a primary. But what we need to let folks know is that the constitutional amendment is something that we all have to defeat together. And so even though you might not have a competitive primary in your community, you have an ability to vote no for these constitutional amendments. And so it's talking to folks to let them know, yes, you actually do have a campaign that matters, and it's with changing our fundamental document that governs this state. And the other piece that we know when it comes to visibility and connection goes to, we have to share oftentimes this information 3 to 7 times. And so it's easy ways in which you can kind of talk about the vote no campaign that's going on. It's changing your Facebook profile picture. That's what we did when we did the state treasurer's race. We had everybody try to change their Facebook profile picture so they could see it, and folks were asking about it or what that meant, to asking individuals to write letters to their local paper, letters to the editor, or put an informational kind of blurb in their church bulletin or in their PTA paper, because this isn't partisan. These constitutional amendments are nonpartisan issues that are affecting all Wisconsinites. And so I think it's really easy to also talk about these in a lot of different places, whether it's with your book club or your PTA. And so part of this goes to, we've got to meet folks where they are and leveraging our networks. And so I think that's one of the kind of big takeaways we had from how we were able to defeat and vote no for the state treasurers, is through connection and visibility and optimizing that within our own network. The second piece is with our ability to communicate. As I mentioned at the beginning, we know that the legislature is purposefully making these constitutional amendments very complicated when you read them. And oftentimes your first inclination is, why not? Let's help move the state forward and vote yes. And so how we are kind of talking about this in a very simplistic way, and I know some of the other speakers are going to talk about this, but when you would boil these two constitutional amendments like down, what it is it's a power grab. It's a power grab by the legislature to have sole control over how we are distributing our federal funds. And that's not okay with Wisconsinites. And when we look at that with our messaging, talking about a power grab or talking about how we are further kind of removing checks and balances in our system, we can talk about then how the impacts of this. And so these constitutional amendments, if we would take away the governor's ability to quickly and efficiently distribute federal funds, some of the ways in which we would see potentially things that could be impacted are with our emergency funds. So when we declare a state of emergency, the federal government steps in, provides resources, which often goes to our communities and first responders. And that wouldn't happen quickly if the legislature was the one controlling it or determining where it went or how it went to. Another place that we would see an impact is with public health. We saw during COVID how federal funds were distributed. We were quickly able to get shots in arms and put up the necessary like action plans to keep people safe and healthy. Again, going through the legislature and only the legislature and their ability to kind of manipulate and control, and how that would impact public safety, our public health. And we saw this even most recently with the avian flu, how Wisconsin got funds that went to local communities and to farmers. Another way that we could see, for example, how this would impact the state would be when there is an emergency. Sometimes people are underemployed or unemployed, not for any circumstances that they have done themselves. And so we need the federal government to step in and help with unemployment benefits. And that would then only go through the legislature, and how unemployment benefits would be distributed or accounted for. And so and then the final area that we could also see a significant impact, in addition, would be potentially with transportation. We know our federal partners are key in helping to fund our bridges and roads, and that could be stuck into the red tape and manipulation of the legislature. And again, because they have worded this in such a very kind of obtuse and confusing way, there's a lot of things we just simply don't know. And it's going to be, unfortunately, if these constitutional amendments pass, through lawsuits, and likely because of, attacking the way ARPA funds are being used for like supporting small businesses or childcare, for example. So there is a lot at stake, and it's really critical that we can kind of boil this down to talking about it from this power grab and diminishing checks and balances to the detriment of Wisconsinites, and the way that we need the federal government to step up and how we're able to quickly deploy those resources. And kind of the final takeaway that I will share when I look at the state treasurer's amendment committee and how we successfully defeated it was action. We started only a few months before the constitutional amendment was going to be on the ballot in April, and it was just a small group of individuals. It was me, Jack Voigt, the former state treasurer, Republican state treasurer, and we're all willing to just kind of work together. And so I think all of you know in your work with Grassroots North Shore how important these people powered campaigns are, and how we only win by a few votes per ward. That's it. Um, each and every one of you have the ability to make sure that we vote no and kind of stop these undercover attacks on our democracy. And it's really important that we are going out there and talking about them and educating them, educating folks on what they mean, why they're on the ballot, because we can really stop this once and for all. So I am very grateful to Grassroots North Shore for shining a light. These have sometimes gone undercover, and we have seen the impact that these amendments have had. And so thanks for learning more, for sharing, because I know together we can stop this and continue to protect the state from what would be a horrible power grab by the legislature. So for more information, there's actually a website that is up. In addition to, I'm sure, the resources that Grassroots North Shore will be providing you. So you can visit wivotesno.org. Again, that's wivotesno.org. And they have all sorts of talking points and information that can help you assist when you're, maybe writing to your local neighborhood association or putting a post about it on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and reaching out to your community. So thanks again for having me, and keep up all the great work, everyone.
Next, we hear about the amendments from an organizer with the Wisconsin Conservation Voters. Ian Schmidt Ernst is a young man who will bring a special perspective to our meeting, and we are thrilled that he agreed to join us today. Ian, I turn the meeting over to you.
Thank you all. My name is Ian Schmidt Ernst. I'm here with Wisconsin Conservation Voters. I'm the Southeast organizer for the organization, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I know this wasn't maybe the way we had all planned on, but unfortunately, that is the reality of things with climate change, and that's one of the reasons our organization is involved in working to oppose the amendments. I'm sure we all would have liked to be enjoying the weather, but extreme weather events are becoming all the more common. But thank you again to Grassroots North Shore. Thank you to everyone involved in getting this together. And thank you to all of you watching this, because these amendments on August 13th, it's incredibly important that we defeat them. So with these amendments, it impacts the distribution of federal money. So currently, in most cases, the governor works with the legislature to determine how money is being spent, but also for some federal money, it's important the governor has power to distribute this money. So these amendments, if they pass, would eliminate checks and balances here in Wisconsin. They're trying to eliminate checks and balances and to trick voters into giving sole power for spending federal funds to the legislature. So currently, like I said, they work together to distribute most federal funds, but there are some examples, including for emergency relief and for big federal programs, that it's important the governor has the power to get these funds out the door right away. So one of these examples is the Pelican River Forest Project and the Wolf River in Wisconsin. There was federal money that came in for that, and it was important the governor had the authority to distribute this. Another example that we at Wisconsin Conservation Voters were very interested in is there's $62.4 million available in the Solar for All program for the state of Wisconsin to invest in solar for low and moderate income households in the state. Other examples where it's important the governor has the authority to distribute federal funding include extreme weather events and flooding, some agricultural issues if there's a disease for crops or animals, livestock. But for flooding, you can imagine it's important the governor can get that money out the door right away into the hands of the impacted communities instead of the legislature having to go meet in Madison, and with the current legislature, who knows how long that might take. So really, if these passed, they would eliminate checks and balances, but they'd also, like I was mentioning, block emergency relief. So these amendments could block or slow funding for emergencies that require help right away. A flood, a bridge collapse, or a pandemic affecting people or livestock. And during a crisis, communities can't afford these delays caused by requiring legislators to go out to Madison and to go vote, or by the political gridlock and fighting over how to spend federal funding. And with the extremely gerrymandered legislature, although that is hopefully changing, of course, and Robin Vos and extremists in the legislature, the gridlock makes it very difficult to agree on anything. So currently there's $125 million that was passed in the state budget. So at the state level, money that's already set aside to address PFAS contamination in the state. So this is something Wisconsin conservation voters has spent a lot of time working on. PFAS are forever chemicals that are cancer causing and found in things like nonstick pans and firefighting foam. And it's important that we get this money out the door. This money, $125 million, passed over a year ago at this point, and it still hasn't gone out. It's currently sitting in a trust fund. So even though the money was allocated in the state budget, due to gridlock in the state legislature, this money hasn't gone out the door. So that's just one example of the current gridlock. And if these amendments pass, there would be even more gridlock in the legislature. When hospitals and first responders need funding, they didn't pass a single bill for 6 months in the state. And this year, they blocked money, like I was saying, for toxic chemicals in our water, and also blocked settlement money to address the opioid epidemic. In addition to these amendments eliminating checks and balances, blocking emergency response, and leading to more gridlock here in the state, they're also deliberately confusing. These amendments were designed with deliberately confusing language, and these are the first constitutional amendments ever put on a low turnout August election ballot. And special interests that wrote these amendments don't want Wisconsin voters to understand them or for their voice to be heard. So that's why Wisconsin conservation voters and so many groups are working to get the word out about these amendments. We've done a lot of research and talked with voters, and really the thing they care about is just getting the information out and learning what these confusing amendments mean. So Wisconsin conservation voters, we've developed in coalition with some other groups. There's a referendum committee organized called Wisconsin Votes No. So with Wisconsin Votes No, we are working in coalition with so many great groups, including Planned Parenthood Advocates of Wisconsin, Power to the Polls, Blue Green Alliance, Evergreen Action, Wisconsin Farmers Union, and the Wisco Project. And we've developed materials to communicate with voters ahead of the August election. We have things like these flyers, these one-pagers. We have pledge to vote cards, where we'll talk with individuals and there'll be information on here, and then they'll fill out their information and we rip this off, we save this, and then we mail it back to them ahead of the election. We'll also be doing mailers to hundreds of thousands in the state. There'll be digital ads, yard signs like the one behind me here, and we, along with other groups, are going to be knocking on over 100,000 doors ahead of this election next month. So these groups and the work that we're doing with Wisconsin Votes No is important, but really where it's most important is with folks like you, individuals in groups like Grassroots North Shore and grassroots groups across the state at the local level. Talking with friends and family is the most effective way to communicate about these amendments. So this election is going to be a low turnout election, so every vote always makes a difference, but especially in this election. I encourage you now to write down a list of some people you can talk to about these amendments and why it's crucial to vote no. a list of 3 or 5, 10, or even 20 people, friends and family members, churchgoers, someone at the hair salon, whoever you can think of, to tell them about these amendments. And we have a lot of great resources available to you as well. So you can visit the website. It's on the sign. It's a little hard to see, but it's wivotesno.org. So that's Wisconsin Votes No, wivotesno.org. And on that website, we have a tab called Tell Your Friends and Family. On there, we have a lot of great resources. We have the fact sheet, like I mentioned, and you can download it to share digitally, or a printer-friendly version if you want to print it out or share. We also have an option to download an image and change your profile picture on Facebook. I know this is a great way to communicate with folks, and kind of in a passive way even. People see that, oh, look, Ian's profile picture is different. I wonder what this is about. And maybe they'll reach out to you, or they'll reach out and Google Wisconsin Votes No and these amendments. We also do have sample social media posts available, and you can put these in your own words to make sure that you're communicating in a way that's most authentic. But for example, one thing might say, there are 2 constitutional amendments on the ballot on August 13th. If they pass, they could halt or slow disaster relief by putting our unproductive and extreme legislature in charge of all funding. I'm voting no on question 1 and 2 and hope you do too. You can learn more at www.wivotesno.org. So that's just one example of the language we have on our website. And so, yeah, really telling your friends is the best way to get the word out. There are so many other ways too. We'll have yard signs available, and you can reach out on our website to request yard signs. You can request, or you can print out the flyers. We'll be out tabling in the community, talking with individuals. We'll be collecting pledge cards from folks. Everybody knows in the summer in the Milwaukee area and really across the state, there's something going on every weekend. So we're going to be out at festivals, at concerts, at farmers markets, collecting pledge cards and getting the word out about Wisconsin Votes No and about these amendments on August 13th. They'll have incredible ramifications if they pass for environmental issues and for all sorts of issues, including emergency relief. And we are doing what we can to get the word out about that. Additionally, you can visit, if you'd like to, help out on these from the comfort of your home, you can visit conservationvoters.org/volunteer. We'll be doing phone bank nights where we're calling voters, telling them about these amendments. And these calls are incredibly important because most people aren't aware of these amendments even being on the ballot. And then if they go to vote and they see this language, it's so confusing they might not know how to vote. So we'll be doing call nights to get the word out about these amendments. Additionally, you can contribute to Wisconsin Conservation Voters. So wisconsinconservationvoters.org/donate to make sure we can keep doing this work. And I'd like to just thank you all again. And the main things to remember that we're talking with voters about are: 1, these amendments would eliminate checks and balances. 2, they're blocking emergency response in the state. 3, they contribute to more gridlock. And 4, they're deliberately confusing. So that's why we at Wisconsin Conservation Voters are involved in doing work on this. And that's why we hope you all will be too. So thank you so much, and make sure to go out and vote no on or before August 13th. Thanks again.
Our final speaker is Maggie Dawn. Maggie is the host of the Maggie Dawn Show on Civic Media Radio Network. Before that, Maggie was Milwaukee County's top attorney. Maggie is a truth teller, a BS caller, a problem solver, a policy wonk, a motivator, and a change evangelist. You are going to enjoy this. Maggie, the room is yours.
Well, thank you to Grassroots North Shore. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon, especially Shirley Horwitz and Eileen Stevens for managing all of these many logistics. I wish I could be there together with you all in real life in the flesh. But given all that has happened in the weather today, whew, stay cool and look out for your family members and neighbors. Check in on folks, especially if they struggle with the heat. I know I do, so at least I'm not melting before you. So before I dive in, I just wanted to point out all of the opinions that I'm sharing are my own. They do not represent my employer's civic media or any of my past employers, including Milwaukee County, which we will talk about a little bit this afternoon. Of course, this moment has a really special gravity and seriousness, given that the former president was shot yesterday. And it would be remiss of me to provide comments without noting the moment that we're in and the extremism of this moment. And I think it is important to our topic today, but also given this moment, to remind ourselves that in a democracy and here in the United States, that we resolve our political disputes and conflicts with words and not weapons, and we do so at ballot boxes and not with bullets. Political violence deserves universal condemnation and swift prosecution. Which again leads us to this moment that we're in where words matter. They matter a lot. Tone matters. And truth matters a lot. And with all of that comes this fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves, and not just ourselves as individuals, but ourselves as community members, as family members, and as Wisconsinites, which is, what are our values? Because the words that we use and what we do in ballot boxes are expressions of those values. And I believe that we personally have so much more in common with one another than what separates us. So what are some of those values, and how, Maggie, do they relate to these constitutional amendments that you will see on the ballot on August 13th? As a Wisconsinite and as a Milwaukeean, I think our values have been pretty consistent through my 47 years. We care for others and we care for our community. We care for our families. We believe in fairness, and in times of crisis and need, we come together to help one another. And what we have now is a crisis, really, a crisis that challenges those basic values, that commitment to stand up for one another, to stand together in times of crisis and in need. What we have is a crisis of both politics and democracy. By that, I mean, do we continue to adhere to our democratic principles, to respect the electoral process? And when we turn away from those things, which I believe is what these two constitutional amendments represent, where does that leave us? And my fear, my friends, is that when we turn away from these values of caring for each other, of good policy, and of democratic values, the end is quite chaotic. So let's not do that. What do we have here in these two constitutional amendments, and why do I offer that it really conflicts with what I think are really universally held values, especially here in Wisconsin? Why does it conflict with the values of democratic processes? And why does it conflict with the value of care for others and community, especially in times of crisis and need? The first reason is that these constitutional amendments are frankly an end run around voters' will as expressed in our last gubernatorial election. Voters overwhelmingly elected Tony Evers not once, but twice. He is the governor of our state. And yet, and perhaps because of the fact that Republicans know full well that the measures that they seek, the changes to the law that they seek in these constitutional amendments would never survive a normal legislative process, they would be vetoed by the governor. What these constitutional amendments represent is an end run around democracy. And for that, the sponsors of the bills should be ashamed. And it's especially an end run around our democracy and a violation of our values to respect democratic processes, to respect election outcomes, because we have the freest and the fairest elections in the world, is because not only does it do an end run around the normal way that a bill becomes a law, but the way that the amendments are worded on the ballot is misleading and sneaky. And they have to be called out for being those two things, which is a violation of our democratic principles, and two, sneaky. They're trying to trick voters. Now, for that alone, I could make an argument that you should vote no on the ballot amendments. But of course, there's more. So what do these things actually say? What do we need to know about them? Well, of course, they are constitutional amendments. Secondly, they will not appear on the November ballot. They will only appear on the August 13th ballot. Well, why? Why would it be that Republicans would want to put a constitutional amendment, or two in this case, on a primary ballot that traditionally has such low turnout? Again, because they are trying to trick you, put one over, get one past the voters. And of course, as I mentioned before, these amendments are designed to look reasonable, maybe even appropriate, like they're a good thing, but they're not. Again, the language conceals Republicans' true objectives to disastrous, in fact, potentially life-threatening consequences for you and me and our families and our community. And because of that, it violates our shared value of care for community and others. So again, what specifically do the amendments say? Well, they're basically sort of coming at the same idea from different directions. One of the amendments says, shall Section 35(1) of Article 4 of the Constitution be created to provide that the legislature may not delegate its sole power to determine how monies are appropriated. The Second Amendment states, shall Section 35 sub 2 of Article 4 of the Constitution be created to prohibit the governor from allocating any federal monies without the approval of the legislature. So what's going on here? Why all of a sudden are Republicans so interested in putting through these two constitutional amendments? Well, because past legislatures recognize that in times of emergency or times of crises of health, safety, the overall welfare, real imminent threats to the welfare, again, of you and me and our families and our community, that requiring appropriations to go through the typical legislative process might in fact prevent our state government from stepping in to save lives and make our communities safer, better, to overall increase our health. And we have examples of this, which I'll get to in a moment. So the amendments are trying to change law, and they're trying to change law to undo what our state legislature thought fit to do many, many, many years ago. Again, which was allow the governor to expend federal monies when there is some sort of community health or safety or wellness need that is fairly emergent. In other words, there is an urgent need for these appropriations. So this, in effect, would give Wisconsin's unfair, unreasonable, hyper-partisan, and unconstitutionally gerrymandered legislature new powers that they haven't had for years and years. And what would they be empowered to do? They'd stop a governor from expending federal emergency relief dollars. They would waylay and hold hostage federal aid to subject it to, I mean, God knows what, all sorts of ridiculous partisan compromises and negotiations, which in turn would just slow down getting this critically needed federal funding into our communities. Changing the Constitution in this way would enable hyper-partisan Republicans to inject all kinds of conspiracy theories and anti-science nonsense into policymaking. And it would basically bend the knee of our state government to large corporations and the donor class and their lobbyists, because of course we know that when legislatures are legislating, they're getting lobbied. So this is really about crises and emergencies in our communities that need the governor to act quickly to get federal aid and monies into communities to help each one of us and our families. Now, when I mentioned a moment ago, it would inject conspiracy theories and anti-science nonsense into the critical appropriation or the appropriation of critically important funds. You may be thinking to yourself, well, what's an example of that? Well, we have one in recent memory, and that was COVID relief. Can you imagine subjecting federal COVID relief expenditures in this state to people who denied the existence of COVID, who proposed that, things like mouthwash might cure it, as our friends and family members are dying? That's what this constitutional amendment would do. But we also can look back further in our state's history and know how disastrous this would be for all Wisconsinites, because it happened in the big tobacco lawsuits. Everyone remembers that they happened. We all remember the terrible lies that big tobacco executives told before Congress. We may have even seen some of the public service advertisements telling us not to smoke. And that was all good. But here's what didn't happen from the big tobacco lawsuits. None of that money ever got to local communities here in the state of Wisconsin. It all ended up in the general ledger of the state government, where partisan wrangling and special interests kept that money from getting into our communities. Now, I know of what I speak here because as Milwaukee County's former corporation counsel, I led the state, at least the local governments of our state, in groundbreaking litigation against the opioid manufacturers and distributors. But we had learned from our experience in Wisconsin that leaving it to the Wisconsin gerrymandered, hyper-partisan, unreasonable, unfair, unconstitutional legislature to determine how those settlement proceeds would be divided would be disastrous and would cost Wisconsinites their lives. So we put forward special legislation that carved out the opioid funding from all other appropriations processes in the state and made sure that the state legislature could not get its hands on it and hold those monies hostage for whatever, again, partisan or extreme purposes an individual legislature may have sought to forward. As a result, in the state of Wisconsin, every single one of the jurisdictions that sued the opioid manufacturers and distributors and joined Milwaukee County, those participating jurisdictions were the beneficiaries. So you and your families and other communities across the state were the beneficiaries of one of the most, if not the most favorable allocation of each and every dollar that is allocated to the state of Wisconsin under the opioid multi-district litigation settlement. In the state of Wisconsin, of every dollar, 70 cents of it goes into our local communities. That is one of the generous, if not the most generous allocation in the United States. And that was possible because we knew that we had to cut out the state legislature. And finally, so we've talked about COVID relief dollars, we've talked about big tobacco, we've talked about my experience with opioids, but we can just look in this state's budget process that we're not budget process, but budget biennium that we're currently in to see that these constitutional amendments would be disastrous if we vote for them on August 13th. And that is because $125 million was allocated in the 2023-24 state budget for PFAS remediation. You know, that stuff that causes cancer. that's in basically everything. Where does that money sit today with the legislature in control of its expenditure? It sits in an account doing nothing, while communities across the state continue to struggle with PFAS remediation. There is help there, budgeted for, sitting there, unused, because the state legislature wants to advance, again, its hyper-partisan, gerrymandered, unconstitutional agenda. It puts strings on a bill to expend those dollars that would have weakened the state's spills laws, which is the mechanism that gives the State Department of Natural Resources the authority to hold polluters accountable. I ask you, is that not exactly what would happen with every single federal dollar coming into this state? That it would be waylaid. Let's not listen to scientists or experts that actually know how to remediate PFAS. Let's not listen to our public health experts and local governments about how to help people struggling with addiction, especially opioid addiction. Let's not do that. Let's give it to our hyper-partisan, unconstitutionally gerrymandered state legislature and, hope it turns out all right. I, for one, say no. So what, in the end, Maggie, is this really about? This is about tricking voters. It's about undermining the will of the vast majority of Wisconsinites that voted not once, but twice for Governor Evers. I mean, ask yourself, where was the Republicans' concern about this balance of powers back when Scott Walker was governor? What is this really about? This is about Republicans thumbing their nose at many of us who are the most at risk. Thumbing their nose at many of us who will be the most harmed if critical federal funds don't get into communities when we're hurting. What is this really about? This is about science deniers and hyperpartisanship and, frankly, a Republican gerrymandered unconstitutional legislature that's beholden to corporate donors and the donor class. What is this really about? This is about giving Robin Vos more control, which I'll offer to you. Talking to our conservative friends and family members, most of them don't like Robin Vos either. So yeah, you want to give Robin Vos control over federal funds? Not a good idea. I'll just conclude by saying this. For those of you that are wonks, I am what I consider to be an institutionalist. I believe deeply in the separation of powers. But what we have seen in the state of Wisconsin is the embrace of lies, the embrace of misdirection, fundamentally by Republicans in this state and writ large. So I'm happy to go back to worrying about this balance of powers, and maybe I'd be happy to consider these constitutional amendments when these things are again true, when Republicans return to normal, when sanity has returned to our political discourse, when hate of people who aren't like you isn't a trend or a political strategy, when tenderness and gentleness and our common cause are again our strengths. When we regulate guns and not gals and girls, when climate science is no longer denied, when everyone's health and dignity is valued, when everyone's right to vote is protected, when we return to one person, one vote, when corporations are no longer people, when money is no longer speech, when insurrectionists are not called patriots, when freedoms and rights are not for the chosen few, but for all, and when presidents are no longer kings, I'll be happy to revisit this topic. But until then, it's my opinion that if you want to protect your health and your family's health, if you want to lift up your community, and if you want to express what I think are our universal values as Wisconsinites, then vote no on August 13th on the 2 constitutional amendments. On the other hand, if you want the donor class and big corporations to have a vice grip-like control over critical federal funding that will save our families and save our communities, then go ahead and vote yes on August 13th. If you want to put Robin Voss in control of federal funding in the state, then go ahead and vote yes. I'll be voting no. So in closing, again, I'd really like to thank Grassroots North Shore for asking me to speak with you all. I wish you all the best. Be sure to check out Grassroots North Shore's website for more information. And of course, listen to the Maggie Dawn Show, which is on live from 2 to 4 p.m. Mondays through Fridays across the Civic Media Radio Network here locally in Southeastern Wisconsin. That's 5:40 a.m. Also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, through the Civic Media app, which is free, and online at civicmedia.us. So I'll end my comments today as I end all of my shows, which is to say this: I will stand up for you. I hope you'll stand up for me, but it is always better when we stand together. Vote no on the 2 constitutional amendments on August 13th.
Good evening. I'm Cheryl Moranto, co-chair of Grassroots North Shore. We've been through a couple of really rough weeks. I'm still trying to get the knot out of my stomach. But whatever curves were thrown or whatever insanity happens, our mission remains the same. Each of us must do what we can to save our freedoms for our families, our communities, and our future. We've faced these challenges before in our country. I just finished listening to the latest Rachel Maddow podcast episode of Ultra, and we prevailed. We can and we must do it again. We have important work to do at both the state and national levels. Our next big challenge in Wisconsin is to defeat 2 damaging and purposely misleading constitutional amendments that will be ballot questions on our August 13th primary ballot. Grassroots North Shore has produced informational vote no flyers that need to be distributed. We've cut turfs of strong Democratic households in Glendale. If you can take a turf and do the lit drop, contact Norma Gilson at normagrns@gmail.com to volunteer. We're also doing follow-up phone calls to the strong Democratic women in Ozaukee County who received our postcard about the ballot questions. These are very easy phone calls to make, and the second touch really increases our ability to get out the vote in this low turnout election. Contact Nancy Kaplan at nancyannKaplan@gmail.com to volunteer. Look for the follow-up email for links to the Wisconsin Conservation Voters website for their volunteer opportunities as well. As Debbie Patel often says, you can't roll up your sleeves while you're wringing your hands. What I say and what Ruth Ben-Ghiat says is the best antidote to despair is to take action. Remember that despair is the autocrat's secret power. Finally, please mark your calendars for our fall election kickoff event on September 8th from 5 to 7 p.m. at Maslowski Park in Glendale. Its title, What Future Do We Want? It's Up to Us. Thank you for joining us virtually. Looking forward to seeing you all in person on September 8th. Good evening.